We are here at the Robbinswood House Estates in the beautiful Seattle suburbs. It's one of the oldest pioneering homesteads in the Puget Sound area. Hans Miller first designed and then built these log cabins more than 115 years ago, and they still remain standing in their same locations. No one would think these logs somehow prepared and then assembled themselves in just the right way. Yet some evolutionists say that the more than 6 million species of plants and animals we recognize on Earth today just assembled themselves in random, undirected chance events. Can the order and design we see in all of nature come from mindless, undirected, chaotic events? Or does design indeed demand a designer? Looking around at what Hans Miller built, no one would question that an intelligent being designed and crafted this estate. In 1895, Hans added this hospitality suite to accommodate his growing family. Just as we can look at what Hans Miller designed and know there was an intelligent designer behind it, we can also look at the marvels and the intricacy we find in nature and know there had to be a designer behind it as well. So says, beyond today's special guest, Dr. Steven Meyer. We're here with Dr. Steven Meyer, author of a great book on the intelligent design theory. It's the Signature in the Cell, DNA, and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Thank you for joining us on Beyond Today.
Nice to be with you.
Good to see you. We're big fans of your work. You've done a lot of research through the years and your college background. Well, tell us, how long have you been studying the subject of intelligent design versus evolution?
Well, I got into this in the mid-'80s. I was working as an oil company geophysicist.
Really?
And a conference came to the town where I was working, Dallas, and it was discussing the big questions at the intersection of science and philosophy: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. And I got fascinated with the whole topic of the origin of life. I had been under the impression that the evolutionary biologists had that topic all sewn up. They had it completely explained, and there were top-of-the-world scientists at this conference who were specialists on the origin of the first life, who were saying, on both sides of the question, those who were friendly to what we now call intelligent design and those who were hostile to it, they all agreed that there wasn't a good evolutionary explanation for how non-living chemicals first produce the very first living cell. So that's when that was 1985, and I got very interested in the topic, met one of the scientists who had been on the panels at the conference, and within a year I was off to graduate school in England doing work on the origin of the first life.
At Cambridge?
Yes, sir.
And you got a double doctorate, I understand?
No, just a single doctorate. We have people at Discovery Institute who have two, and my wife thinks that getting a second one shows that you're not quite right. Why would you do that again?
If you enjoy pain, I guess you would do it, wouldn't you? So tell us a little bit about the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute.
Well, yeah, that's the institutional home for really the intelligent design research community or movement that's now a growing international movement of scientists around the world. We have 40 associated research fellows, most of them in the natural sciences, but also scholars who are historians or philosophers of science or who work in other related disciplines. So we have a formidable array of scholars and a lot of intellectual firepower. But we create documentary videos, and we have started a lab. We've done work advising state boards of education about how to handle the controversial issue of Darwinian evolution in the public schools. So we're involved in a lot of things surrounding this crucial worldview shaping issue of cosmological and biological origins.
Very interesting. You know, many professing Christians feel that they think about the Bible, it talks about God created the heavens and the earth, and they think, well, we have to believe that as an article of faith. There's no scientific evidence or no logical thought pattern that can kind of prove, or at least show and point to a designer who designed it all. How do you respond to those?
Well, the theory of intelligent design is not based on a religious text. It's not based on biblical authority or church authority. It's based on the scientific evidence that we see around us. Having said that, the theory does have larger religious implications that are friendly to religious belief. What the media likes to do is to confuse the basis of the theory, which is scientific, with the implications as a way of stigmatizing the theory to say, well, it's just religion, or it's based on religion, or it's a faith-based idea. It's not a faith-based idea. It's a science-based idea. It's based on scientific evidence and standard methods of scientific reasoning. But when you come to the conclusion that an intelligence of some kind must have played a role in the origin of life, or the origin of the universe, and then you begin to think, well, what are the most likely candidates? Many people do come to the conclusion that the most likely candidate is God, and therefore the theory, at least for some, has very striking religious implications. But the basis of the theory is not faith, it's science.
Very well put, Dr. Meyer. We thank you so much for joining us today on the Beyond the Day program, and we'll have more right after this. Meyer, we're very pleased to have you here, a great author of a book on intelligent design. And there is some evidence that you would point to that you feel, at least, and many people in your institute and elsewhere feel, points to a designer who created everything.
Oh, well, I think there's decisive evidence for intelligence, an intelligent designer behind, for example, the origin of the first life, which is what I've studied for now over 25 years. The thing that excites me most, of course, is the evidence that you find inside the cell, in particular the digital code that's stored along the spine of the DNA molecule. One of the great discoveries of modern science was, of course, the discovery in 1953 of the structure of the DNA molecule, but I think even more important was the insight that came with that discovery 4 years later. It was Francis Crick's great insight called the sequence hypothesis. And he realized that 4 chemicals that run along the spine of the DNA molecule, they're called bases or nucleotide bases, that these 4 chemicals function just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in the machine code, the zeros and ones that we use in software. In other words, it's not the chemical shape or structure of these chemical subunits that matter, it's their specific arrangement. If they're arranged properly, they convey instructions for building the proteins and protein machines that all of our cells need to stay alive. So inside life, what is running the show is literally information in the form of digital code. I think that's an absolutely fabulous discovery, but it's one that also underwrites the case for intelligent design. It's a big part of the scientific basis for it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's almost like a language there that tells the protein how to form and the little machines that run through the cell to create that stuff.
Well, Bill Gates, our local hero here in the Seattle area, has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark because of what we know from experience. We know that it takes a programmer to make a program, a software program, and we know more generally that information in whatever form we find it, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription or a section of software or a headline in a book or something that might be embedded in a radio signal, whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life, embedded in a digital form in the DNA molecule, is a powerful and decisive evidence or indicator of prior intelligent activity, of what we call intelligent design.
And just the DNA code in a single cell is enough to fill 500 books of 1,000 pages each, and very closely knit type, and so there's a lot of information.
Oh, it's packed extremely densely. I lose track of these, these homespun examples, but not that long ago, the information storage density of DNA was some trillions of times greater than our most advanced superchip. So and there you can compare it to phone books and et cetera. But there's a lot of information. 3 billion base pairs in the human genome. 3 billion of those nucleotide characters.
Right.
And in even the simplest cell, we're looking at something on the order of several million. So there's a lot of information even to get the very simplest forms of life.
Yet people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens say God doesn't exist, and they've published very popular books to support their theories as scientists. How do you respond to them when you talk about the new atheist debate? And if you were in a debate, and I've seen some of your debates, they're very good, how do you counter some of their ideas?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I think it's important to clarify that in the scientific work we're doing on intelligent design, we're not arguing necessarily that God is the designer. We don't think from the scientific methods that are available to us we can necessarily identify the designing intelligence responsible for life. But the Darwinian idea is that there's no intelligence involved in the origin of life, that life is the result of a purely undirected process that the appearance of design is an illusion, and that the process of natural selection acting on random mutation can mimic the powers of a designing intelligence without being guided or directed in any way. That's the idea we're taking on, and we're showing that from that using standard methods of scientific reasoning and evaluating the most current discoveries in science, there's powerful evidence for intelligent design. So our work does have implications for the debate about the new atheism, because it undermines the foundational premise of the new atheism. The new atheists, like Dawkins, say, since Darwin showed that there was no design behind life, and since the design argument was always the strongest argument for the existence of God, we can now say that belief in God has no objective basis, that it's tantamount to a delusion, a subjective dream or something. And what intelligent design does, among many other things, is it completely undermines the premise of the new atheist argument. It shows that, no, there is evidence of actual intelligent design, of actual design. Therefore, there is an actual intelligence behind it. And then it becomes a matter of philosophical and theological deliberation as to the identity of that designing intelligence. I, myself, am a Christian and a theist, and so I believe that the intelligence responsible for life is God. But that's something that goes beyond the more narrowly focused scientific argument that we develop as part of the theory of intelligent design.
Some people believe it was kind of just an accidental happening, random circumstances through the universe that created it. And they often wrap this concept in the theory of billions of years of time, which makes it appear more plausible. What's the bottom line? If you had to get to the bottom line of the argument against evolution in favor of intelligent design with an atheist or with a believer in evolution, one of these scientists, what would you say?
Well, what I do in the book Signature in the Cell is develop an argument for intelligent design using a standard method of scientific reasoning. In fact, it's a little bit mischievous of me, but it's the very same method that Darwin used in The Origin of Species. I come to a decidedly non-Darwinian conclusion, namely that there is evidence of actual design, not just the illusion or appearance of design. But nevertheless, I used Darwin's method, and he had a principle of reasoning, which was that if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you should invoke causes that are known from our present experience to produce the effect in question. Now, what's the key effect that needs to be explained? To explain, for example, the origin of the first life. Well, it turns out that it's information. If you want to build a living cell, you have to have digital code. It's just like with a computer. If you want your computer to have a new function, you have to provide software. If you want to build life, you have to have the DNA and the information it encodes to build all the important protein parts that keep cells alive. So the key, the central part of the argument is that we know of one and only one kind of cause which is capable of generating information, and that cause is intelligence. And all the other naturalistic causes that have been proposed, whether they're based on chance or based on natural laws or some combination of the two, have failed to demonstrate the ability to generate information. So we know of only one kind of cause that can produce information. That cause is intelligence. There's information in life and at the foundation of life, and even the simplest cells. So that suggests that there must have been an intelligence responsible for the origin of the very first life. That's the argument in a nutshell. And in the book, I take on all the different naturalistic or materialistic attempts that have been made to explain the origin of information, not just the ones that are based on chance, but also others based on law-like properties as well.
Design demands a designer, I guess is really what you're saying.
It comes back to that. It does demand a designer, but that's not a logical principle. It's something that we can now affirm because of our careful study of all of the different possible causes that have been proposed to explain the origin of information. And so it's the result of a long and careful examination of what we know about nature. Nature does not produce information starting from physical and chemical precursors. You need a mind. And we know this from experience, lots of examples. The faces on Mount Rushmore. When you look at those faces, because we know that information always arises from an intelligent source, when we see those faces, and we could think of that as an artistic depiction of information. It's not in a digital form, although it could be digitized. But you see an effect which you know from experience only arises from intelligence. You can infer back to the intelligence. Interestingly, a very materialistic-minded group of scientists have for a long time been searching for intelligence in space. It's a project called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It was just only recently discontinued because of funding problems, they didn't find any evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. But it's very interesting as to what they were looking for. They were looking for encoded messages and radio signals. They were looking for information. And they understood that information is a distinctive hallmark of mind, of intelligence. Had they found information embedded in radio signals coming from space, they would have inferred that there was an intelligence behind them. And so this is the key idea, is that what we know about cause and effect can allow us to determine a cause from an effect when the effect is distinctive of one and only one kind of cause. And information is distinctive of one and only one kind of cause, and that cause, again, is intelligence.
Dr. Steven Meyer, we certainly appreciate you joining us on Beyond today. It's been very informative, and we look forward to having you back in the future. And we'll have more right after this. Imagine a barren, lifeless earth with no trees, no flowers, no beautiful butterflies, no living creatures of any type, no land animals, no fowl in the air or fish in the sea, not even the simplest speck of life in the very simple one-celled creature. Charles Darwin proposes in his famous letter in 1871 to botanist Joseph Hooker that life began in some warm little pond, maybe something like this one. But instead of water, it was filled with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts. Did we humans climb from slime or come from scum and some non-living premortal soup? If that were so, at least one time in the distant past, there would have had to have been the breaking of a universally accepted law of science. The law of biogenesis states that life comes only from pre-existing life, not from dead matter. Many professing Christians feel there's no logical or scientific evidence that supports the biblical concept of creation, and that they have to believe that God created the heavens and the earth as an article of faith. So where did all this beauty and intricate design we see in more than 6 billion species of plants and animals come from? Dr. Steven Meyer has been studying the ideas surrounding evolution versus intelligent design for more than 30 years. The evolutionary theory holds that life somehow spontaneously generated itself out of non-living matter. Evolutionists have difficulty explaining how the very first life on Earth began, and that it is arguably one of the most important and fundamental reasons to consider intelligent design. We're here with Dr. Steven Meyer, author of a great book on the intelligent design theory. It's the Signature in the Cell, DNA, and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Dr. Meyer, thank you for joining us on Beyond today.
Nice to be with you.
Evolution, if you think about the concepts that have come recently in the last 20 years from evolutionists, a theory that's been around for over 150 years, there seems to be a growing plethora of all these new ideas of how the first life on Earth could have begun. How do you see that? Doesn't it look a little confusing to say 150 years of research, we haven't come up with a theory even that is consistent among evolutionists?
Well, a lot of people don't realize that Charles Darwin did not explain, or even attempt to explain, the origin of the very first life. He presupposed the existence of life in some simple form and then attempted to explain how that pre-existing simple form of life evolved and changed and became all the forms of life we see today. But as to the origin of that first simple cell, he had no account. He had some vague speculations that he wrote in a letter, but
he looked at it as a blob, and of course today we know the DNA structure.
Well, right. In the 19th century, scientists didn't worry about it too much, the absence of an explanation for the origin of life in the 19th century, because they assumed that life was what they called it, a simple, one of Darwin's contemporaries, Thomas Henry Huxley, said it was a simple homogeneous blob of plasm. It was like a hunk of jello or something. And so the absence of an explanation for it didn't seem too terrible at that time, because people assumed that you could explain the origin of life as a result of a few very simple chemical reactions. But now we know that the cell is complex on order of a CAD-CAM kind of factory where you have digital information directing the construction of mechanical parts, and that's an oversimplification, you know. So the problem of how you explain the first simple cell has become very much more difficult, because we know the cell isn't really simple.
So why is understanding where the first life came from important?
Well, this is an area of science which also has larger philosophical, or I would say worldview implications. A worldview is a coherent set of beliefs that answer some basic philosophical questions. And the most important question that any worldview has to answer is what philosophers sometimes call the question of metaphysics, or what sometimes has been called the question of the prime reality. What's the thing from which, or the entity from which everything else came? Now, when you get into scientific questions of origins, they necessarily are answering questions about ultimate origins, of the origin of life, the origin of the universe, and so forth. So if you are able to explain the origin of life as a result of purely materialistic processes, purely chemical interactions, then that would provide support for a larger materialistic story of how everything came to be, and therefore it would also provide support for materialistic worldview. If, on the other hand, you can't account for the origin of the first life, apart from intelligence, apart from mind, then that is going to provide support for what philosophers call an idealist worldview, or in one particular form of idealism is the idea of theism, that God is the mind behind all of life. And so these questions of origins, though they be scientific, also invariably intersect these big philosophical questions.
Because of the widely accepted view of evolution means there isn't a God, that he doesn't have laws that you have to live by or follow, it seems to me that that might have a connection with the moral toboggan slide the world seems to be on.
Well, Dostoevsky said that if God is dead, then all things are lawful. And Richard Dawkins said, to quote another luminary, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Darwin's was a scientific theory. He was trying to give an account of the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. But his theory denied that there was any role for design. He didn't just affirm the meaning of evolution as change over time. He also was trying to show that it was a purely undirected mechanism that produced the change over time. That was the idea of natural selection acting on random variations, and we would now say mutations. So his theory of evolution was denying that there was any evidence of actual design. Design was an illusion because he said natural selection could produce the appearance of design without being guided or directed in any way. And so his theory, though it was scientific, again, it had larger worldview implications, and generally they've been seen to be supportive of a materialistic or atheistic worldview in which there's no role for a designer or creator of any kind. So it's a very important scientific issue that has larger implications.
So was Darwin's goal really to eliminate the need for a God?
Well, I don't know. I think in some ways he was trying to figure out what was true. But he certainly was, I think, very mindful of the whole context of what was called natural theology, attempts to prove the existence of God from the evidence of design in nature. And he wanted to show that at least science should be free of invoking a designing intelligence of any kind. He confessed near the end of his life to be in a hopeless muddle about the metaphysical question of the existence of God. So I think it's more fair to say he was an agnostic than an atheist, but his scientific theory allowed no room for any kind of designing mind or intelligence or creator of any kind, and therefore it lent itself readily to a more materialistic worldview in which God was absent.
Very well put, Dr. Meyer. We thank you so much for joining us today on the Beyond the Day program, and we'll have more right after this. Here is Dr. Steven Meyer. We're very pleased to have you here, a great author of a book on intelligent design. And when you think about the first life form, a planet Earth with no life at all in any form, and how in a chemical soup or whatever theory you want to hold to, somehow these chemicals came together through random chance and created the first life form. But doesn't it actually break a law of science to think of spontaneous generation coming from non-living matter creates life of some type?
Well, this is one of the ironies of the whole discussion of the origin of the first life, and that is that soon after Darwin published his theory, The Origin of Species, scientists began to wonder about the origin of the very first life because, as I said, he didn't address that question. And nearly at that same time, Louis Pasteur was in France establishing that all claims to spontaneous generation that had been made to that point were actually the result of pre-existing organisms that had contaminated various kinds of samples. Right. So spontaneous generation was fully discredited. At the same time, scientists began to think about not exactly spontaneous generation, but another form of getting life from non-life, these chemical evolutionary theories. They added the extra element of lots and lots of time, But that really hasn't solved the problem. 150 years out now from Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, we're no closer to having a chemical evolutionary theory of the origin of the first life than we were in the 19th century. And in fact, the impasse is so severe in origin of life studies that even people like Richard Dawkins, who's not known for his restraint and advocacy of evolutionary theory, has acknowledged that no one knows how the first life began. And yet that's not talked about as openly as you might think, given how widely it's known within the scientific community. Many textbooks today, for example, still present the famous Stanley Miller Harold Urey experiment, in which amino acids are produced in a flask as a result of being sparked with some energy. And we now know that experiment is completely irrelevant to the origin of the first life, because the atmospheric conditions they assumed are not the ones that actually were present on the early Earth. And in any case, even if you get amino acids, it doesn't explain how you arrange the amino acids properly to produce a functional protein. In all living cells, those arrangements are determined by code, by the information present in DNA. And so the Miller-Urey experiment, even if it were relevant, and it's not, bypasses the crucial information problem, which is really the source of the impasse. It's the reason that scientists have been unable to explain the origin of the first life from a purely materialistic standpoint.
So talk a little bit about some of the theories evolutionists have.
Well, the first really serious theory to try to explain the origin of the first life was offered by a Russian scientist named Alexander Oparin in the 1920s and 30s. And it was modeled after Darwin's theory of the origin of species. He invoked time and chance and various natural laws and processes to try to give what was called a chemical evolutionary account of the origin of the first life. Trying to explain how you get from simple chemicals in a prebiotic soup, as it was called, to the very first cell. And Oparin had a very elaborate scenario that he developed, and it had some traction for a while. It was very popular. It became the dominant theory of the origin of life in the 20th century. But after the discovery of the complexity of proteins first, and then secondly, the complexity and information-bearing properties of the DNA molecule in the second place, Oparin's theory gradually began to seem less and less plausible. And I would say by the late 70s and early 1980s, the whole field of origin of life biology, or the theory of chemical evolution, had come to a place of almost complete impasse. And it's not gotten any better since then. There are some new ideas that people proposed, but essentially the basic problem of explaining the origin of complexity and the origin of integrated complexity and the origin of information has, I think, produced a situation in which there is no accepted theory of the origin of life, at least from a chemical evolutionary point of view.
You would think the more research they do, the more they find in the complexity of the cell, that they would have more evidence that evolution occurred if that was the case.
Well, exactly right. Oparin himself said that the question of the nature of life and the origin of life, those two questions are intimately connected, because what we know about what life is determines what we have to explain if we're trying to account for its origin. And the problem, in a way, the paradox of this is that the more we've come to know about the inner workings of the cell, not only the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule, but the whole information processing system and the nanotechnology, the miniature machines that are involved in processing that information, the less likely it has become that simple chemical processes could account for the origin of such systems. So the more we've learned about the nature of life, the more skeptical many scientists have become about chemical evolutionary theories of its origin. Exactly the opposite of what people expected to find.
Some scientists see the mathematical impossibility of just chance, as long as they've come up with a theory of chance plus necessity. Explain what that's all about.
Well, initially it was the idea that you could, as the Darwinians did in biological evolution, combine random variations or random mutations with the process of natural selection. So the idea was that maybe there's a form of pre-biological or prebiotic natural selection in play that would allow, that would harness chance events to generate the information we need to build life.
Make it more likely because there's a
right.
necessity.
So it's not just chance alone, but it's chance plus this law-like process of natural selection. But there's a big problem with that.
Which is?
Well, to get natural selection going, you need organisms that can copy themselves and generate offspring that can compete for survival among themselves. In other words, you need the capacity for self-reproduction, or self-replication as it's called. But self-replication in all existing organisms takes place because of DNA and proteins, information-rich DNA and proteins that are importantly involved in cell division, for example. So to build a self-replicating organism, to get natural selection going, you need a self-replicating organism. But to get a self-replicating organism, you need information-rich DNA and proteins.
So which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, what were we trying to explain in the first place?
Yeah.
Information-rich DNA and proteins. So in order to explain the origin of information, you invoke natural selection, prebiotic natural selection, but that just presupposes the very thing you're trying to explain in the first place. So it's a question-begging argument.
Yeah.
I tell an illustration in my lectures to get the point across of an absent-minded philosopher of science. Picture anyone you might think of, and walking home from his office, and he falls in a big pit, 30 feet deep, and he says, "I know, I need a ladder." So he says, "No problem." He goes home and gets a ladder, comes back, jumps in the pit, and climbs out. Well, obviously my story begs a question, which is a very similar thing. To get natural selection going, in order to explain the origin of information, you got to presuppose the origin of information in the first place. It's like you're just jumping or climbing out of the pit without a ladder. It begs the question of where that information came from.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Steven Meyer, we thank you so much for joining us today on Beyond Today.